So in this section, we're going to touch on texture and how to achieve the texture that you desire. If you've ever had a wimpy soup where it just kind of fell flat or the texture was kind of off, well, in this section, we're going to learn how to achieve the desired texture that you want in your soup. Texture is important in cooking in its ability to please. When we make soup, we have the choice of making it thick or thin, or creamy or chunky. When we make soup thick, we have some choices there. My favorite is probably to puree the soup. So partway through the cooking process, I throw my soup ingredients into a food processor or a blender. I process it until I get the texture I want, and then I put it back in the soup pot and continue cooking. You can also use some of your starchy ingredients to add thickness to your soup, or you can add starch powder in some water in the form of a slurry and add that to the soup, and that will thicken the soup. If you want to thicken the soup just a little bit, you can leave the cover off and simmer the soup, and some of the liquid will evaporate off, thus making a thicker soup. So starch powder come in different forms. The most common that you'll find in your average supermarket is cornstarch, but you can also find rice flour and tapioca flour in Asian markets. You can also use the starch ingredients that are in the soup itself. So if you've got potatoes in there, you can mash a few potatoes. Beans are starchy, so if you mash a few beans and keep simmering, the starch will release from the beans and thicken the soup. And then also rice. If you add rice to your soup, the starch from the rice will release into the liquid and thicken it that way. There is a method to adding starch flour into your soup, and this is the way to do it. If you were to just put the starch flour straight into the soup pot, it will clump and it'll be very hard to get those clumps out. So be sure and add the starch to cold water first, stir it until it dissolves, and then add it to your simmering soup. In order to make a thinner soup, you can almost do the opposite of how you made your thick soup. So one way is to reduce the starchy ingredients that you have in your soup. You can also add more liquid into your soup, and that will make it thinner. And then back in the beginning, when you're cooking your aromatics, you have the choice of either dicing them small or leaving them in really large chunks. So for example, for an onion, instead of dicing an onion, you would cut it in half and let it simmer in the soup that way. That way later you can actually retrieve those easier, and you've extracted the flavor from the aromatics, but you're taking them out of the soup, thus making it thinner. You just learned how to achieve the desired texture in your soup. So now what you want to do is just experiment a little. Try these different techniques and see what works for you. In the next module, we'll touch on the main ingredients that make a great soup.